In the summer of 1942, the war on the Eastern Front entered a phase defined as much by movement of coal, fuel, grain, and ammunition as by movement of infantry and armor. The German leadership launched Case Blue with two linked aims: to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and to sever the Volga transport artery that linked those resources and the rear industrial regions to the fighting fronts. Stalingrad, a rail and river hinge on the western bank of the Volga, became central because it connected river traffic from Astrakhan and the Caspian, with rail lines running northwest to Saratov and Moscow, west to the Donbass, and south along the Volga corridor. A city that before the war handled millions of tons of freight per year now became a gate through which the state moved fuel from Baku, bread from the Volga steppe, and armaments from the Urals into a front that had to be fed daily. The preconditions for the logistical battle were set by technology and geography. The Soviet rail system used a 1,524 gauge. The German system used 1,435 mm. Every advance therefore demanded conversion crews, bridge repair battalions, and a continuous supply of rails, sleepers, spikes, and ballast. The South Russian rail network contained extensive single-track sections, which limited throughput to timetables that could be disrupted by bridge demolitions, partisan attacks, and competing priorities. The Volga, by contrast, was a long and relatively protected axis running from the Caspian to the upper reaches near Gorky. Barges, tankers, and ferries could move bulk loads at lower fuel cost per ton-kilometer than trucks or aircraft, but they depended on seasonal water levels, visibility, and riverbank infrastructure under air attack. Both sides entered 1942 with sharply different supply profiles. The German Army Group South had a modern staff culture that calculated daily requirements in trains and tons. A field army operating offensively with several corps typically required rail deliveries on the order of multiple trainloads per day to sustain fuel, ammunition, rations, engineer materials, and replacements, with truck columns bridging the last 50 to 150 kilometers from railhead to corps depots. The Luftwaffe could augment delivery by air for surge or emergency needs, but its transport fleet, dominated by Ju-52s with payloads in the 2 to 2.5 ton range under forward conditions, was sized for mobility operations and episodic lifts, not for continuous line of communications replacement of rail tonnage. Fuel stocks, tire wear, and engine hours became constraints that planners tracked alongside enemy order of battle. The Soviet command began 1942 with a rear that had been transformed by evacuation. In 1941, entire plants, machine tools, and skilled labor had been shifted east of the Volga. By mid-1942, the Urals and western Siberia were increasing output of small arms, artillery, shells, and vehicles. The transport directorates prioritized east-west lines feeding the Volga ports at Saratov and Kamyshin, and river fleets were organized to shuttle cargo downstream to Stalingrad and upstream with wounded and evacuees. The Stalingrad area also anchored a lateral rail connection across the Don Bend, which allowed switching of loads between river and rail depending on air threat and bridge availability. The State Defense Committee paired this with strict rationing of fuel and rolling stock, moving assets among fronts according to offensive schedules rather than unit requests. Intelligence and estimation shaped decisions before the first assault troops approached the city. German assessments in May-June 1942 judged Soviet reserves in the southern theater as recoverable but finite, and they assumed that cutting the Volga near Stalingrad would sharply reduce the flow of Baku oil to central Russia and the northern fronts. Operational maps translated that assumption into logistics. Seize crossings over the Don near Kalash, convert the lines through Morozovsk and Surovikinyo, and push railheads to within truck distance of the Volga. Luftwaffe 4 was tasked to degrade river movement by bombing piers, ferries, and moored craft, while interdicting the few double-track rail segments that fed the city from the north bank. Soviet staff work in July-August 1942 estimated that the Stalingrad sector would need continuous replenishment for both field armies and the city's defense industries. The river flotilla and port authorities scheduled round-the-clock barge convoys with night crossings at the city to reduce exposure to air attack. Rail marshalling yards on the east bank were dispersed, and temporary unloading points were prepared in reed-covered inlets and lesser wharves to permit cargo transfer even when the main riverfront was under bombardment. The civil administration began layered evacuations of civilians, raw materials, and machine tools. Staging train consists by cargo class to accelerate throughput in narrow time windows between raids. Public sentiment and political aims intersected with freight schedules. In Berlin, the capture of the city that bore Stalin's name was presented as a measurable indicator of progress. In Moscow, holding the Volga line and maintaining its traffic were framed as conditions for sustaining the armies across the southern half of the front. Neither side's propaganda altered the practical arithmetic of fuel, axle loads, and track slots, but it affected priority calls. At German headquarters diverted trucks and engineer units to forward stretches to maintain momentum, while Soviet leaders authorized additional anti-aircraft assets and camouflage materials for the riverbanks, even at the cost of other sectors. Military preparedness in both camps contained mismatches between intent and infrastructure. The German advance widened frontage and deepened supply lines faster than rail conversion could follow, increasing reliance on motor columns over dust roads that degraded tires and fuel economy. Temporary bridges over the Don required constant maintenance. Each collapse or closure forced detours that consumed drivers' hours and gasoline. On the Soviet side, the capacity to produce at scale east of the Volga did not automatically translate into delivery at the front edge. Bottlenecks formed at transshipment points, where river cargo had to be winched into rail cars or onto trucks for the last leg to divisional dumps on the western bank. By September, when the first continuous house-to-house fighting began in the city's northern and central districts, both commands were operating within these structural realities. The German 6th Army and supporting elements of 4th Panzer Army aimed to consume fuel and ammunition at rates compatible with rail deliveries to their forward depots west of the Don, while the Soviet Stalingrad and Don fronts balanced river lift, East Bank rail intake, and ferried delivery under fire. The stage was set for a contest in which daily requirements and actual deliveries could be compared in concrete figures: trains unloaded, barges crossed, sorties flown, tons issued, and tons expended. The logistical battle would proceed not only along streets and factories, but across timetables, loading slips, and docket books that recorded whether planned inputs matched the consumption of a campaign measured in days. Plans on both sides translated strategy into arithmetic. For the German command, the destruction of Soviet forces west of the Volga and the seizure of a bridgehead at the river were to be sustained by railheads advancing behind 6th Army and the right wing of 4th Panzer Army. Supply planners broke requirements into daily categories in tons: fuel for mechanized elements and generator units, artillery ammunition from light field shells to heavy howitzer charges, small arms cartridges, engineer materiel, rations, medical stores, and replacements. The intended method was sequential. Rail conversion would push standard gauge to key nodes at Morozovsk, Surovikino, and Kalak. Field depots would be established at distances compatible with truck turnarounds in daylight. And Luftwaffe 4 would preserve momentum with targeted interdiction of Soviet crossings and yards, not with substitution for rail tonnage. The figures used in July and August assumed that an army of several 100,000 men with attached core artillery and armor would be stable if forward depots received several trainloads per day, while truck companies could cycle 2 or 3 round trips in 24 hours over dry steppe roads. The Luftwaffe and the Army coordinated for what they termed air bridging, a surge capacity to push forward critical items when roads or rails were interrupted. Standard tables gave a Ju-52 payload in theater conditions at roughly 2 tons per sortie from prepared strips near the railheads. Heavier types could carry more, but demanded longer runways and scarce maintenance resources. The precondition was airstrips within secure radius of the front and fuel delivered to them by the same rail that served the Army. The planning documents made a distinction between bridging days, when air would lift high-value items like fuel additives, radio spares, optical sights, and artillery fuses, and routine days when rail and motor transport would cover the bulk of consumption. Engineer planning underpinned this model. Rail conversion battalions were tasked to lift and relay track at rates measured in kilometers per day, replacing destroyed sleepers and aligning ballast under fire. Bridging columns carried prefabricated spans to restore dawn crossings, with calculated load classes so that locomotives could pass at reduced speed. Each timetable slot allotted to a troop or supply train implied a slot denied to evacuation, prisoners, or damaged materiel returning west for repair. The Army group staff prioritized fuel forward in the opening phase, accepting deferred delivery of winter clothing, tentage, and axle spares. This decision would have consequences as the calendar advanced. Soviet objectives and planning in the same period approached the city as a hinge of a wider theater. The State Defense Committee and the People's Commissariat of Railways defined Stalingrad as a river rail exchange rather than a terminal. The design principle was redundancy. If piers and the main riverfront yards were struck, traffic would still reach the sector by dispersal to minor wharves and temporary beaches. The Stalingrad front staff calculated daily needs for the defense of the city proper, and for formations arrayed on the approaches on the west bank, while the Don Front and later Stavka, reserves on the east bank required stockpiles within ferry distance. River planners broke the Volga lift into barge trains escorted by gunboats and minesweepers, with night crossings scheduled to reduce exposure. Loads were grouped by category to minimize rehandling. Ammunition and fuel were moved in separate convoys for safety, while rations and medical stores were aligned with troop ferries to simplify distribution on landing. Rail intake on the east bank was organized around Saratov, Kamyshin, and the network feeding from the Urals. The Commissariat established rolling priorities in which ammunition for small arms and field artillery, mortar rounds, and fuel for river craft and motor transport received top billing, followed by replacements and heavy weapons. Camouflage detachments covered marshalling yards with nets and smoke generators, and anti-aircraft regiments were deployed to protect choke points and river bends. Civil authorities synchronized evacuations with inbound traffic to prevent platform saturation, timing passenger trains between freight windows. In the planning tables, the river was treated as a low-cost bulk conveyor, whose capacity could be expanded by additional holes and night hours, while rail remained the limiter determined by locomotive availability, track condition, and successful repair of bridges north of the city. Both sides carried miscalculations into execution. German staff work assumed that rail conversion and bridge restoration would keep pace with divisional advances. In practice, delays compounded. Blown culverts forced detours, single-track sections created meets that cut throughput, and the extension of the front increased truck distances to depots, reducing the number of daily cycles and raising fuel consumption per delivered ton. Tires and engines wore at rates above peacetime norms because dust, heat, and long idling at choke points degraded performance. The Luftwaffe's planned interdiction of the Volga did not produce a sustained stoppage. Bomb damage closed individual piers and set fires, but the river's length, the availability of alternative landing points, and Soviet night schedules diluted effects. When German headquarters later examined the option of sustained air supply to cover shortfalls, the arithmetic did not match standing daily consumption of multiple Army corps. Soviet planning accepted that daylight movement on exposed river reaches would draw continuous air attack. The remedy was not a single protective system, but multiple partial measures: dispersal of loads, convoying under smoke, and the use of smaller ferries in shallow inlets. A recurring misalignment arose between East Bank stockpiles and West Bank issue. Even when barges crossed successfully, unloading under fire and onward movement through rubble and cratered streets slowed distribution to battalions in the forward blocks. Staff estimates of daily needs for rifle divisions and tank brigades often exceeded actual deliveries at unit dumps, because ferries, lighters, and trucks could not be turned fast enough. Nevertheless, strategic production and rail intake kept the flow to the sector above a minimum threshold, allowing formations to rotate companies through the perimeter and to rearm artillery with limited but steady stocks. Propaganda framed these logistics decisions in different terms. German bulletins emphasized forward movement and the approaching fall of a named city, indirectly encouraging risk acceptance in diverting engineer assets from maintenance to assault support. Soviet broadcasts emphasized the continuity of the Volga lifeline and the factory district's endurance, reinforcing decisions to allocate additional anti-aircraft and camouflage resources to the riverfront at the expense of quieter sectors. Neither narrative altered the figures on planning sheets, yet both influenced sequences of work that affected capacity. Which bridge span was repaired first, which siding was camouflaged, which pier was repiled overnight. By early September, the planning phase had matured into daily routines. On the German side, trains were scheduled to reach forward depots west of the Don with calculated intervals. Truck companies queued at loading points with dispatch sheets listing item categories and destinations by core dump, and airfields staged fuel drums and fuses for aircraft assigned to interdiction. On the Soviet side, rail consignments were broken in East Bank yards into river loads by commodity. Barges were assigned times and escorts, and ferry slips on the city's shore were assigned to specific divisions to minimize confusion at night. The gap between calculated daily requirements and attainable deliveries had not yet become a crisis, but the margins were thin. The ensuing battles would test whether those margins could sustain combat intensity, measured not only in streets taken and retaken, but in tons consumed and replaced within each 24-hour cycle. The first engagements around the city unfolded as a chain of logistics-limited thrusts rather than a single continuous surge. On 23 August 1942, armored spearheads of the German 16th Panzer Division seized the Don crossing near Kalach and drove to the outskirts of Stalingrad, while a large air raid struck rail yards, oil depots, and riverfront facilities. The advance shortened truck distances from the new railheads west of the Don, but not enough to eliminate the need for long motor hauls over dust roads. Corps depots near Kalash and Surovikino issued fuel and 75mm and 105mm artillery shells for the dash toward the Volga. The issue rates matched expectations for a mobile pursuit, but exceeded them once urban resistance forced close combat. On the Soviet side, the Stalingrad front rerouted arriving trains to East Bank yards and began sustained night ferrying across the Volga. Cargoes were split into ammunition consignments for rifle divisions, mortar rounds for factory district positions, and fuel for rivercraft and truck columns tasked with onward delivery inside the city. Between 24th and 31st August, the German 6th Army shifted from movement warfare to methodical clearing on the northern approaches. LY's Army Corps pressed toward Rhinoc and Spartakovka, while XIV Panzer Corps probed the central and southern sectors. Daily supply sheets reflected the change. Artillery expenditure climbed sharply, and infantry units requested higher ratios of grenades and submachine gun ammunition suited to close quarters. Trucks that had carried fuel now cycled sandbags, bridging planks and engineer stores for street fighting. Luftwaffe 4 redirected sorties from deep interdiction to attacks on the riverfront and observe ferry points. Soviet planners, anticipating these patterns, moved more crossings to night hours under smoke and dispersed unloading to small inlets shielded by reed beds. The river flotilla added minesweepers and gunboats to escort barge trains, and anti-aircraft regiments shifted batteries to cover the most active slips. On 2 to 5 September, German formations closed on the city's northern arc and contested the riverbank industrial zone. The fight for Spartakovka and the settlements near the tractor plant converted logistics to short-haul distribution under fire. German battalions drew resupply from forward company dumps only a few blocks behind the line, but replenishment of those dumps depended on narrow corridors repeatedly cut by counterattacks and shelling. Each interruption forced truck columns to wait, or to attempt detours through rubble, increasing turnaround times and idling losses of fuel. Soviet rifle divisions received small but regular night deliveries of 7.6 2mm cartridges, 45mm anti-tank rounds, and 76mm field gun shells ferried in crates that squads hand-carried from landing points to block-level caches. When daylight interdiction halted ferrying, defenders rationed fire and shifted to mines, satchel charges, and close-range ambushes that demanded less ammunition per hour than open-field engagements. Command changes and unit rotations influenced the pattern of consumption and delivery. On 12 September, Vasily Chuikov assumed command of the 62nd Army on the West Bank. His staff formalized a rule that each rifle regiment would designate porters and boat crews for specified landing slips, ensuring that night consignments did not accumulate on the shoreline. Small reserves of food, bandages, and radio batteries were pre-positioned in basements to avoid daylight movement. German Corps headquarters, facing rising expenditure, ordered tighter fire discipline for heavy artillery and introduced scheduled issue windows to smooth demand at depots. The effect was mixed. Scheduled issues reduced congestion at loading points, but fixed windows created gaps that frontline companies filled with ad hoc requests, transmitted over overstretched signal nets. The first large urban assault began on September 13th, when German divisions attacked into the city center toward the Central Ferry and Mamayev-Kurgan. Street fighting created new categories of logistical need. Flame projector fuel, demolition charges, and ladders entered daily issue lists for assault detachments, while Soviet units requested additional submachine guns and fragmentation grenades suitable for stairwells and factory floors. Medical evacuation on both sides strained transport. German stretcher parties required vehicles to reach casualty collection points through lanes swept by mortar fire, tying up trucks that might otherwise have carried ammunition. Soviet evacuation moved largely by night across the river, with medical boats prioritizing the most urgent cases and returning with ammunition or replacements on the downriver run. Territorial control shifted by city blocks and by hours, with direct effects on supply. When German troops took the upper slopes of Mamayev-Kurgan on September 14th, observation improved over ferry approaches, increasing daylight interdiction accuracy. Soviet response was procedural rather than purely tactical. Crossings were rescheduled deeper into darkness. Loads were reduced per craft to shorten unloading, and decoy fires and smoke pots were ignited at unused piers to draw attacks. In the south, the fight around the grain elevator and adjacent rail sidings during September 17th to 20th illustrated how single structures could shape delivery. The elevator's height provided observation over tracks and sidings. When German infantry entered the area, Soviet trains approaching the southern yards halted farther north, forcing additional river movement and longer hand-carried hauls inside the city. German companies that secured the sidings gained temporary ease of resupply by rail-to-truck transfer within shorter distances, but repeated counterattacks prevented the establishment of a stable depot. Morale and civilian conditions intersected with logistics without determining them. Civil authorities, still responsible for remaining residents and workers, synchronized evacuations with freight movements to avoid platform saturation on the East Bank. Factory brigades contributed labor to repair slips and laid duckboards across cratered streets to keep handcarts moving. German military police managed traffic flow at key intersections west of the Don to limit convoy conflicts between assault supply and rear service trains. On both sides, rumors about imminent victory or collapse affected small decisions. Drivers volunteering for additional night runs, port workers staying past scheduled shifts, but the throughput remained bounded by bridge capacity, road conditions, and the number of hulls and trucks available. Unexpected outcomes derived from these constraints. Luftwaffe raids damaged piers and started fires along the central embankment, yet river movement did not cease. Soviet use of secondary landing sites and night schedules preserved a baseline intake that, while below staff targets on many days, kept frontline units from exhausting ammunition stocks entirely. German infantry cleared sectors and reached the river in narrow salients, but the deeper they advanced, the longer and more fragile their supply corridors became, increasing the share of engineer and security troops required to keep routes open. The net effect by the end of September was a city divided into multiple contested logistics zones. German depots near the western approaches worked at planned capacity, but faced rising last-kilometer friction. Soviet East Bank yards continued to receive trains at calculated intervals and converted them into river loads, but ferry cycles and urban distribution imposed a ceiling that could not easily be raised in daylight. The first engagements thus set a pattern. Tactical gains were feasible, but sustaining them required daily deliveries that the terrain, the river, and the available transport could only partly meet. October converted the campaign into a sustained crisis for transport on both banks of the Volga and across the Don Bend. German formations massed for renewed assaults into the factory district, while their rear services worked to hold a delivery rhythm that had been calibrated for mobile operations in August. Lieutenant General Army Corps and 14th Panzer Corps prepared coordinated attacks for mid-month against the tractor factory, Barricadi, and Red October. The concentration demanded predictable intake at forward depots of artillery shells for 105mm and 150mm batteries, 75mm tank ammunition, engineer explosives, and fuel for assault guns and panzers. Depot ledgers west of the Don recorded days when trains met plan and days when bridge repairs or partisan damage upstream cut arrivals to a fraction. Each shortfall translated into stricter rationing at corps level, where daily issue tables were revised to keep a minimum for the next day's assault, rather than to meet full requests. Soviet command treated the same period as a problem of maintaining a continuous, if uneven, flow across narrow time windows. On the night of 13 to 14 October, Rivercraft began moving additional infantry and ammunition to the lines facing the tractor factory. The 62nd Army allocated landing slips by regiment and designated porters at battalion level to move crates from the shore to company caches before first light. Shore parties used sledges, hand carts, and improvised stretchers to keep movement off the cratered streets where truck engines drew artillery fire. East Bank yards near Krasnaya Sloboda and the approaches from Saratov adjusted timetables to send smaller consignments at higher frequency, reducing the loss when a single crossing was caught by air attack. German assaults opened on October 14th, with multiple divisions pressing into the factory belt. The tempo of ammunition expenditure rose as infantry and sappers cleared workshops and yards. Tank battalions reported increased use of high explosive and canister against strongpoints. The effect on logistics was immediate. Forward company dumps, established in courtyards and behind berms, ran on schedules measured in hours. Distribution sections attempted to maintain 2 line of communication corridors per battalion, but counterattacks repeatedly closed one or both, turning resupply into a sequence of short, escorted pushes timed between barrages. Luftwaffe 4 shifted more sorties to direct support and to strikes against ferries and barges within artillery observation. A share of these sorties also targeted the East Bank marshalling yards, temporarily halting switching and forcing trains to hold on approach lines where they were less vulnerable but also unable to unload. Soviet units inside the factory complex adapted by lowering daytime consumption where possible and raising night intake. Mortar teams stacked rounds in cellars. Machine gun crews rotated barrels and set fixed fields of fire to conserve belts. Artillery fire was brought down in shorter, pre-planned defensive bursts, triggered by flare signals to reduce the risk of ammunition stranded at landing points. The 37th Guards Rifle Division, 95th Rifle Division, and later arriving regiments took over sections of assembly halls and foundries, organizing ammunition caches by caliber in stairwells and boiler rooms to shorten hand-carry distances. Medical evacuation followed the same pattern in reverse. Wounded moved to cellars during the day and to the shore after dark, with boats returning across the river loaded with replacement riflemen and crates of 7.62 2mm cartridges. Rear area pressures accumulated for the attackers. The road net feeding Kalash and Surovikinho suffered attrition from continuous traffic. Motor columns faced longer maintenance cycles as engines ran hot in low gears through rubble zones, and tires failed at higher rates on debris-strewn surfaces. Security detachments were diverted to keep corridors open, reducing available labor at depots. Engineer units that might have reinforced bridges or laid additional sidings were retained at the front to support daily assaults with Bangalore torpedoes, ladders, and smoke generators. These allocations sustained pressure in the city, but deferred work that could have raised throughput in the rear. Corps staffs responded by standardizing issue windows, designating priority lanes, and assigning traffic control to military police at key nodes, measures that reduced chaos but could not add vehicles, fuel, or rails. For the defenders, the river remained the decisive limiter. On nights when the wind dropped and smoke hung low, crossings were faster and losses lower. On clear, still nights, observation improved and interdiction tightened. The flotilla introduced more gunboat escorts and used smoke generators on anchored barges to mask approaches. When larger ferries drew too much fire, movement shifted to smaller craft with reduced loads, increasing the number of trips required and the labor of portage ashore. East Bank rail intake remained steady on most days because the network beyond the Volga was less exposed, but conversion of trains into waterborne loads depended on the availability of hulls, crews, and functioning slipways. Any damage to a slip could cost several cycles, which at the company level meant a day without replenishment for a single sector. As the crisis extended through late October, flanks began to shape the logistics picture. Romanian and Italian formations held long stretches north and south of the city, requiring supply over secondary routes and competing for transport with the German divisions driving into the factories. On the Soviet side, the Don Front and reserves on the East Bank required stockpiles for planned counteroffensives. Those stockpiles drew on the same rail arteries as the 62nd Army's nightly needs, compelling prioritization at Stavka level. The resulting trade-offs appeared in unit diaries. Certain nights brought additional artillery ammunition for prearranged fire plans. Others brought mainly rations and replacements, with artillery instructed to hold to pre-war basic loads. Weather introduced new variables without determining outcomes in October. Rains turned sections of the steppe roads into mud, extending truck turnaround times and increasing fuel consumption per delivered ton. River levels and currents fluctuated, affecting crossing times and mooring. Both commands measured these effects in schedules. German depots added allowances for longer queues at loading ramps. Soviet river controllers inserted slack into convoy plans to maintain the overall number of crossings. Neither side could add significant new capacity quickly. Manufacturing of hulls, locomotives, and trucks was a strategic process measured in months. The fight in the city demanded adjustments measured in hours. Political leaderships monitored these constraints through summaries rather than through direct control of timetables. Reports to Berlin emphasized progress by street and by industrial objective, with notes on ammunition and fuel as explanations for pauses. Reports to Moscow emphasized the volume of crossings completed and the rotations maintained on the West Bank. Public statements acknowledged neither shortages nor surpluses, but shaped expectations that influenced subsequent allocations, calls to accelerate conversion crews, to move anti-aircraft assets, or to transfer specific divisions into the sector. By the end of October, the escalation had stabilized into a sustained crisis. German units held portions of the tractor factory grounds and pressed into barricadi. Soviet formations maintained contiguous pockets along the riverbank and in the factory halls. Daily requirements remained higher than the most efficient days of delivery on both sides, and the shortfalls were managed by rationing, improvisation, and the redefinition of objectives from block to block. The outcome of this phase was not a decisive territorial shift, but a recalibration of what each side could sustain. The attackers could still mount powerful assaults, but only at tempos governed by rail and road repair, and by fuel at forward dumps. The defenders could still hold and counterattack, but only as long as night crossings, East Bank intake, and urban distribution could be kept within the narrow tolerance that separated a usable flow from a nominal one. The peak of the campaign arrived as a concentration of preparation measured in trainloads, pontoon sections, and stockpiled shells. In early November 1942, Soviet commands completed a buildup for a double envelopment around the city. Southwestern and Don fronts amassed fuel, ammunition, and bridging assets along the Don, between Serafimovich and Kletskaya in the north and near Kotelnikovo and Beketovka in the south. Rail brought formations to staging areas on the East Bank and to jump-off zones west of the Don, where bridges already existed. Ammunition parks were layered by caliber to reduce confusion during night issue. Mortar bombs in forward parks. 76mm and 122mm shells one echelon back. fuel in drums at protected ravines. Staff tables for the opening artillery preparation allocated thousands of tons across the first 48 hours, with resupply routes plotted to each Army sector by time rather than merely by distance. On 19th November, the northern blow opened against Romanian Third Army. The logistics signature was immediate. Artillery densities rose to pre-planned levels along short sectors, and truck shuttles pushed forward more shells as batteries advanced. Engineer columns ferried infantry over iced river bends and dropped prefabricated pontoon bays to carry guns and light vehicles. The following day, the southern attack struck Romanian Fourth Army. Soviet control measures kept the routes distinct. One corridor for fuel and anti-tank ammunition to exploit breakthroughs, another for rations, medical supplies, and engineer stores to secure crossings. In both sectors, the objective was not only to push combat units forward, but to move the supply axis behind them fast enough to keep pace. By 23 November, armored spearheads linked near Kalak. The ring tightened around German 6th Army and elements of 4th Panzer Army inside an area that would be supplied thereafter only by air. The encirclement transformed German logistics into an air equation. Before the ring closed, rail still fed forward depots west of the Don. Afterward, all deliveries intended for the pocket had to be staged to airfields outside, loaded onto transports, flown across a contested corridor, unloaded on strips within range of Soviet artillery, and then moved by horse carts and trucks inside the pocket to unit dumps. Staff estimates of daily needs for a force of more than 200,000 personnel with thousands of horses and hundreds of guns range between 500 and 700 tons, depending on the level of combat. Fuel, bread, and artillery ammunition dominated the lists. The Luftwaffe set targets well below the requirement, but still above what the available aircraft, crews, and weather could guarantee. Transport groups assembled at Morozovskaya, Tatsinskaya, Salsk, and Novocherkassk with Ju-52s, Press-T-100s-11s, and a smaller number of larger transports. Serviceable aircraft counts fluctuated with losses, maintenance, and weather, and did not match the tonnage goals on most days. Inside the pocket, distribution reorganized around the available airfields. Pitomnik became the principal hub for intake, medical evacuation, and dispatch. Gumrak, closer to the city, served as a secondary field and later as the fallback when Pitomnik came under heavier fire. Landing cycles were calculated in minutes. Loads were standardized where possible to accelerate unloading. Bread sacks, rifle ammunition boxes, 105mm shell crates, and fuel in drums. Each landing required the runway to remain usable and secure for the time needed to turn the aircraft. Snow, ice, and shell holes reduced throughput even when aircraft arrived. Horse teams then pulled sledges or wagons from the airfields to divisional depots through corridors under observation, adding hours to every ton delivered. For the Soviet side, the peak combined two parallel tasks. First, maintain the nightly provisioning of 62nd Army across the Volga, so that the defenders in the factory district could continue to hold and counterattack. Second, feed the encircling fronts as they established an outer ring against relief attempts from the west and southwest, and an inner ring pressing toward the pocket. The first task kept the river flotilla operating under cold, fog, and intermittent air attack. Loads emphasized small arms cartridges, mortar bombs, hand grenades, and rations. The second task drew on railheads farther from the river, with depots feeding armies along wider arcs from Katchalinskaya to Verkhne Kurmojarskaya. Engineer units laid roads over frozen ground and maintained pontoon bridges against ice movement. Artillery shells and fuel were stockpiled for counterattacks against expected thrusts toward the pocket. November's closing days in early December brought the highest sustainment demands. On November 25th-27th, the German command organized attempts to break out or break in, then set them aside in favor of holding and awaiting relief. This decision shaped the airlift. When units did not attempt to move westward, daily consumption dropped compared with a breakout attempt, but the requirement still exceeded deliveries on most days. a small number of days saw totals above 200 tons delivered by air when weather and serviceability aligned. Many days fell well below that. Losses accumulated. Aircraft forced down on snowfields could not be recovered quickly. Ground crews at forward strips worked under shell fire with limited spares. The pressure to fly increased engine hours beyond peacetime maintenance intervals. The Soviet logistical peak included the preparation for relief interception, Southwestern Front concentrated forces near Kotelnikovo for Operation Little Saturn and for counter-thrusts against any German attempt to reach the pocket. Stocks of anti-tank ammunition and fuel were forward-loaded to meet panzer divisions expected to advance along the Chir and Excise sectors. Don Front stockpiled shells for batteries that would later open the January offensive to reduce the pocket itself. Each ton assigned to these operations was a ton not sent across the river to 62nd Army, and staff tables balanced these allocations daily. The river crossings did not cease, but their rhythm followed the wider plan. Peaks before scheduled attacks in the city, troughs when weather, ice flows, or air raids forced pauses. Airfields beyond the pocket became targets as part of the logistical battle. On 24th December, armored forces of 24th Tank Corps reached Tatsinskaya, a principal staging base for transports. The raid destroyed aircraft on the ground, damaged fuel and maintenance facilities, and forced the Luftwaffe to shift operations to more distant fields. The immediate effect was a reduction in sorties and longer flight times to Pitomnik and Gumrak, further lowering daily intake during a period when units inside the pocket needed more shells and rations for continuous defensive fighting. The necessity to disperse aircraft also complicated loading schedules, as depots had to truck cargo to additional airfields over winter roads. Within the city, December fighting maintained high consumption for both sides. German battalions held sectors of the factory belt and the central district, expending small arms and mortar ammunition at rates determined by local counterattacks. Artillery units rationed shells according to corps schedules that correlated issue to predicted threats rather than unit requests. Bread rations and horse forage were adjusted repeatedly. Soviet formations rotated fresh regiments into selected blocks while keeping others on minimal issue to conserve stocks for coordinated actions. Medical evacuation across the river operated on fixed night windows, and the return trips continued to bring ammunition and replacements into the same slips. Weather intensified friction without replacing planning. Freezing temperatures improved some roads and aided sled transport, but fog grounded transports and delayed artillery observation. Ice on the Volga changed ferry procedures. Boat crews cut channels and shifted to lighter loads to keep crossings on schedule. Both commands recorded days when logistics plans succeeded despite the conditions, and days when they did not. The peak of the campaign therefore appears in ledgers as an oscillation around targets that were rarely met. The airlift could not raise average intake to the required level, and each loss of an aircraft, runway hour, or trained crew widened the gap between requirement and delivery. The Soviet supply system, dispersed across rail, road, and river, met most of its planned allocations to encircling forces and enough of those to the 62nd Army to maintain the defense. But it also showed limits in the tempo of urban distribution and the capacity of narrow crossings. By the end of December, both sides had reached sustainment ceilings defined by their chosen methods. The German force in the pocket depended on a chain that began at distant railheads and terminated on iced runways within artillery range, with internal movement then constrained by fuel scarcity and exposure. The Soviet encirclement depended on rail lines extended across winter steppe, on roads maintained by continuous engineer work, and on a river lifeline that continued to function in reduced but steady cycles. The peak was not a single day of maximum fighting, but a period when daily arithmetic repeatedly tested the plans. How many tons planned, how many moved, how many issued, and whether those numbers matched the consumption of armies that could not choose to pause. Adaptation on both sides took shape as procedures measurable in grams, minutes, and meters. Inside the pocket, German staffs introduced tiered ration scales indexed to duty. Frontline rifle companies drew daily bread at 300 to 400 grams in early December, declining toward 200 to 300 grams when air deliveries fell below 150 tons. Rear services and headquarters drew less. Horse meat and rendered fat supplemented rations. Forage stocks for several thousand animals were consumed and then replaced by slaughter, which saved fodder tonnage but reduced haulage capacity for sleds and wagons. Ammunition issue tables were revised to favor small arms and mortars over heavy artillery. Batteries received fixed allowances per day and fired prearranged concentrations only on signal. Divisions with higher hand grenade expenditure were instructed to reallocate from sectors with lower activity rather than request additional crates that could not be guaranteed by air. Distribution methods adapted to exposure. From Pitomnik, later from Gumrak, supply sections loaded standard sledges with 7.92 mm and 9 mm boxes, 50 mm and 81 mm mortar bombs, and bread sacks. Teams moved along marked corridors, screened by snow berms and walls. When shelling cut a route, runners recorded delays in minutes and rerouted by pre-plotted alternates. Internal fuel policy shifted from vehicles to heat and essential generators. Petrol was assigned to ambulances, snowplows, and a small number of liaison cars. Armored vehicles received only enough for short local moves. Where trucks could no longer be justified, handcarts and horse sleighs took over, reducing tonnage per trip but increasing survivability in narrow streets. The airlift also improvised. Transport groups mixed Ju-50s-2s with He-100s 11s fitted with floor inserts, each run carrying roughly 1.5 to 2 tons under winter conditions from the nearest fields. On days with fog or heavy flak, drops replaced landings. Crews pushed sacks of bread and cartridges through cargo doors at low altitude over marked panels. Accuracy varied with wind and visibility. Loads scattered when wind shear caught parachutes, and some fell outside the perimeter. To improve intake, ground parties painted new panels, lit shielded beacons, and posted retrieval squads to collect drops within minutes. Medical evacuation followed the reverse path. When Pitomnik functioned, several hundred wounded could be flown out in a day. When only Gumrak remained, numbers fell into the low hundreds or below, depending on runway condition, shelling, and aircraft availability. Soviet resistance and adaptation in the city balanced conservation with controlled surges. Night crossing schedules were refined to 12 or more narrow windows, each keyed to a specific regiment and slip. Loads were standardized by task. A company lift might be 12 to 16 crates of 7.6, 2 mm, 6 to 8 crates of grenades, 2 to 4 crates of 50 mm mortar bombs, and ration bags, with weights manageable by designated portage teams. To conserve ammunition, battalions issued fire plans with fixed arcs and limits per hour. Defensive shoots by 76 mm batteries were cut to brief. High-density bursts to disrupt assaults rather than prolonged harassing fire. Machine gun crews rotated barrels by stopwatch to prevent failure that would force emergency resupply. When stocks ran short, sapper teams increased use of mines and expedient charges built from captured fuses and explosives. Urban movement adapted to bombardment patterns. Covered lanes were cut through walls to connect cellars along entire blocks, allowing hand transport under roofs. Ropeways bridged short courtyards where ground was swept by fire. In the factory district, workshop cranes that still functioned lifted crates from riverboats to mezzanines, from which porters relayed loads down stairwells into firing sectors. Units cataloged usable enemy stocks by caliber to prevent issuing non-standard ammunition where it would waste time. Captured 7.92 mm weapons were grouped with captured belts and magazines at company level to avoid mixing with 7.6, 2 mm logistic chains. On the encirclement fronts, adaptation addressed winter roads and long supply arcs. Engineer regiments broke ice on river crossings, then framed lanes with planking to mobilize sled traffic. When temperatures stabilized, ice roads carried heavier loads. Controllers posted weight limits per axle and distances between vehicles to prevent collapse. Fuel distribution shifted to drums staged in ravines and behind shelter belts, with pre-positioned siphons and hand pumps to shorten vehicle idle times. Artillery supply parks moved at night in echelon, the forward park holding only 2 to 3 days of 76 mm and 122 mm stock to reduce losses from counter-battery fire, the rear park feeding by schedule rather than by ad hoc requests. Where rails ended, truck battalions adopted fixed circuits measured in hours to smooth flow and reduce queuing. Both commands experimented with camouflage and deception to protect scarce capacity. German ground crews dispersed aircraft into revetments, rolled dummy fuselages onto visible aprons, and shifted runway thresholds to avoid craters. Soviet river forces moored empty barges at decoy slips, hung smoke pots upwind of active lanes, and ran small craft with lights to draw fire while the main loads crossed unlit. On particular nights with poor visibility, crossings doubled, with each craft carrying reduced loads to shorten mooring time. On nights with clear skies, commanders accepted fewer, heavier runs, escorted by more guns to keep total tonnage within the minimum needed to maintain frontline stocks. Human factors were recorded alongside tonnage. In the pocket, sick reports logged frostbite and dysentery, rising as heated shelters and hot food grew scarce. Commanders reorganized rest into shorter, more frequent rotations, sometimes measured in hours out of the line rather than days. Field post inflow declined as the airlift prioritized ammunition and bread, lowering morale markers that staffs tracked informally. On the Soviet side, ferry crews accumulated fatigue from repeated night runs. Flotilla commanders rotated boatmen and gun crews by strict rosters and aligned their schedules with infantry rest cycles. Civilian workers on the East Bank, including evacuated factory hands, labored on slip repair, crate packing, and camouflage net production in shifts matched to train arrivals to avoid idle cargo. Innovation appears in small techniques rather than new equipment. German sections cut bread into standardized portions using wire to accelerate issue and reduce crowding at company kitchens. Ammunition bearers pre-lashed mixed loads to sled frames to eliminate on-site packing. Soviet units color-coded crate markings to be readable in low light and stenciled destination blocks to reduce misdirection under stress. Signal platoons laid buried lines through frozen ground to keep resupply orders off congested radio nets, while runners carried pre-printed dispatch slips to limit errors in the dark. Quantitatively, adaptation did not erase the gap between needs and deliveries, but it narrowed shortfalls on given nights or days. When airfields operated for full cycles and weather allowed landings, intake for the pocket reached over 200 tons and ration scales could be kept at the higher end. On days with fog and raids, intake fell well below 100 tons and scales dropped accordingly. When ice roads stabilized and smoke covered the river, nightly crossings could approach planned figures, keeping rifle companies near their basic load. When slips were hit or ice shifted, deliveries fell, and commanders rationed grenades and mortar bombs until the next window. The ability to measure, schedule, and enforce these adaptations determined whether companies began a day with full magazines and a specified number of grenades per man, or with half of that figure. Morale followed these material curves without fully determining them. Reports from both sides note fluctuations tied to the predictability of supply rather than to single events. In units where bread arrived at the same hour and ammunition at a fixed rate, disorder decreased and casualties from exposure fell. Where deliveries became irregular, commanders substituted tighter fire control, reduced movement, and shorter objectives. Resistance and adaptation at Stalingrad were therefore not improvisations in isolation, but disciplined responses linked to numbers, rations per man in grams, shells per gun per day, trips per craft per night, and minutes to unload at a slip or to turn an aircraft on a frozen strip. The turning point emerged when the arithmetic of relief, encirclement, and air delivery converged in December 1942. On December 12th, German headquarters launched Winter Storm from the Kotelnikovo sector with LVI Panzer Corps, spearheaded by 6th Panzer Division and supported by 23rd Panzer and elements of 17th Panzer. The objective was to reopen a surface corridor to the pocket or, failing that, to approach close enough for a breakout with supplies staged along the route. Relief planning translated into fuel columns, bridge components, and ammunition trains moving along the rail to Kotelnikovo and forward by road to Mishkova River crossings. Each kilometer gained shortened truck distances and promised to reduce the airlift's burden by transferring tonnage to motor transport. Across the same dates, Soviet Southwestern Front initiated Little Saturn on December 16th against Italian 8th Army on the Don, cutting rail lines and forcing Axis formations to withdraw from depots whose inventories had supported both the relief and the airlift staging bases. The relief thrust progressed from December 12th to December 19th, advancing roughly 150 kilometers and reaching the Mishkova line at points less than 50 kilometers from the pocket's southern edge. Supply logs for the 57th Panzer Corps show forward dumps issuing high proportions of 75mm and 88mm ammunition and significant fuel to sustain rapid mechanized movement. Bridge engineers prepared crossings under fire with throughput limited by ice, current, and counterattacks. Communications summarized the situation as a race between fuel delivered to the spearheads and Soviet reinforcement flows moving by rail and road from the East Bank through Astrakhan-Saratov corridors. When 2nd Guards Army arrived and counterattacked on December 19th to 20th, the balance shifted. Relief convoys consumed fuel for holding actions instead of penetration, and artillery expenditure rose above planned levels as batteries met increasing numbers of anti-tank guns and tanks. On 24th December, armored forces of 24th Tank Corps struck Tatsinskaya airfield, a main transport base. Aircraft and ground stocks were destroyed or scattered, forcing the Luftwaffe to disperse to more distant, less developed strips. The immediate effect was reduced sorties and longer flight paths to Pitomnik and Gumrak, lowering daily intake to the pocket during a period when units inside were using more ammunition to repel probes and to cover withdrawals of exposed outposts. Inside the pocket, the decision cycle hinged on whether relief would arrive soon enough to justify conserving fuel for a breakout. Estimates of daily requirement remained between 500 and 700 tons, for the force of more than 200,000 personnel, depending on intensity. Air delivery fluctuated. Several days in mid-December exceeded 200 tons, when weather, serviceability, and runway condition aligned. Many fell below 100 tons when fog, ice, or raids limited operations. Averaged across the period, intake remained well under the requirement. Orders emphasized holding ground, which preserved airfield security, but continued consumption without opening a surface line. Bread rations declined from 300 to 400 grams, to lower scales on days when deliveries were minimal. Artillery fire tables reduced the number of concentrations permitted per day. Fuel was reserved for ambulances, snowplows, and short tactical moves. Ammunition priorities shifted towards small arms and mortars, with heavy artillery receiving fixed daily allowances. For the Soviets, the turning point appeared as the ability to sustain two structures simultaneously: an outer ring repelling winter storm, and a tightening inner ring that constrained German movement around Pitomnik and Gumrak. Southwestern Front supported counterattacks near the Chir and Mishkova with fuel and anti-tank ammunition delivered along stabilized winter roads and rails. Secured after Little Saturn's breakthroughs, Don Front organized stocks for pressure against the pocket's perimeter while continuing nightly provisioning of the 62nd Army in the city. Railheads beyond the Volga remained functional, and engineer units kept ice roads and pontoon approaches open. The encirclement's logistical system thus maintained its planned allocations to mobile forces and to the static siege tasks, while the opposing airlift's capacity declined as bases were lost or pushed farther from the target. By 23rd to 24th December, WWII Panzer Corps had not reached the pocket. Relief planning shifted from penetration to containment, while the airlift attempted to compensate for the absence of a ground corridor. Tatsinskaya's loss and threats to Morozovskaya and Salsk forced redistribution of aircraft and supplies to secondary fields with shorter runways and fewer maintenance facilities. Ground transport inside the pocket lengthened because unloading concentrated at Pitomnik, with Gumrak held in reserve when shelling intensified. Each ton landed generated additional hours of internal haulage by sled or wagon under observation. With distances growing and horses slaughtered to save fodder, the available haulage teams decreased, lowering the effective tonnage that reached divisional dumps even when aircraft landed successfully. Weather during the last week of December produced alternating windows and closures. Fog grounded transports on some days. Clear periods brought heavier flak and fighter interception. Ice on the Volga slowed Soviet ferry cycles but did not stop them. Cutters opened channels, and loads were reduced to keep schedules. The comparative resilience of river plus rail versus air became visible in daily figures. Soviet units in the city entered January with ammunition levels that permitted planned local attacks and controlled fires. German units operated at ration scales and ammunition allotments that permitted defense and short counterthrusts, but not sustained offensive operations without drawing down stocks below the next day's minimums. The strategic effect of Little Saturn extended beyond the Don. The withdrawal of Italian and German units destroyed bridges, clogged roads, and consumed transport that might have supported a renewed relief attempt. Depots that had fed winter storm were either evacuated under pressure or abandoned, reducing the pool of fuel and artillery ammunition available for another large push. Conversely, Soviet staff tables showed increased allocations to formations assigned to hold the outer ring and to assault the pocket in the new year. Trains carried shells and fuel to sectors earmarked for the forthcoming reduction operation, while rations and replacements continued to cross the 62nd Army in smaller but regular consignments. By the first week of January, the air equation tightened further. Runway serviceability at Pitomnik deteriorated under repeated shelling and bombing. Each repair cycle consumed engineer time and materials that could otherwise have supported perimeter defense. Night landings increased, reducing unloading speed per aircraft and raising accident risk. Medical evacuation numbers fell as priority shifted to ammunition and bread. Field medical units noted fewer outbound flights and longer retention of serious cases in aid stations near the airfields. Command decisions reflected these constraints. Orders inside the pocket instructed formations to hold a shorter line to reduce perimeter length and internal haulage distances. This saved men and fuel, but yielded ground that had previously shielded air approaches. On the Soviet side, Don Front set artillery programs and supply clocks for a reduction offensive with fixed start dates, confident that relief from outside was no longer a realistic probability. The turning point, therefore, was not a single day's combat, but the cumulative result of intersecting logistics curves. The relief force's fuel and ammunition intake declined as route length and opposition increased. The airlift's average tonnage stayed below requirement and then fell as bases were lost. The encirclements, rails, roads, and river crossings continued to function at or near planned rates. When viewed in ledgers, December closes with two contrasting lines, one unable to reach its target intake even on favorable days, the other maintaining enough flow to hold the rings and prepare the next phase. January 1943 opened with supply clocks set for reduction. Don Front scheduled Operation Ring to begin on January 10th, with artillery programs and ammunition parks established by sector. Stocks for the opening barrage were preloaded at forward parks. 76mm and 122mm shells for divisional guns. 152mm and heavier calibers allocated by target lists to breach strong points and airfield defenses. Fuel and rations for assault units were staged in ravines and behind berms, while medical evacuation chains and replacement pools were positioned to rotate regiments through the line. The river flotilla maintained night crossings for the 62nd Army, but the main weight of Soviet sustainment now flowed to the encircling formations that would contract the pocket. Inside the pocket, intake by air declined as fields came under closer fire. Pitomnik, the principal hub, operated under increasing artillery observation until mid-January, when repair crews could no longer keep the runway open. Gumrak took over most landings, but its capacity was lower and more exposed. Average daily deliveries fell below figures recorded in early December. Staff notes showed days with fewer than 100 tons landed and days with none due to fog, runway damage, or raids. Bread rations for frontline companies moved toward the lower scales set in December. Horse meat and frozen stores supplemented diets, and medical units reported shortages of dressings and drugs. Ammunition priority remained small arms and mortars, with heavy artillery restricted to short-scheduled concentrations. The Soviet offensive on January 10th to 12th compressed the perimeter and sectors north and west of the city. artillery preparation matched the prepositioned stocks, and assault units advanced behind rolling barrages. The contraction had immediate logistical effects. German internal haulage distances shortened in map terms, but exposure increased, and the loss of covered corridors forced more hand transport under fire. Pitomnik fell around the 16th of January, ending organized medical evacuation by air. Gumrak, still functioning, became the only intake and outbound point of scale. Landing cycles were counted in minutes, and unloading crews worked under shell bursts. When Gumrak ceased to operate reliably after 22nd to 23rd January, air-landed intake decreased further to scattered drops and sporadic landings at improvised strips that could not process heavy loads. On the Soviet side, the inner ring supply routes benefited from reduced distances to objectives but faced congestion on the few serviceable roads. Engineer units maintained ice roads and cut new lanes through debris to move guns forward. Artillery parks refilled at night according to fixed tables, and forward dumps issued ammunition and calibers key to the day's tasks. More 76mm for anti-personnel fire in built-up zones, additional 122mm and 152mm for demolishing masonry positions, and anti-tank ammunition for expected counterthrusts. Rations and boot stocks were brought up to keep units in contact during continuous operations. The outer ring continued to receive fuel and ammunition sufficient to repel pressure from the west, but its consumption decreased compared with December as organized relief attempts declined. Command communications inside the city and across the pocket reflected logistics first. Orders assigned sectors to hold lines closer to the city center to reduce perimeter length and conserve ammunition. Vehicles were immobilized to save fuel for snowplows, ambulances, and essential generators. Horse transport remained the principal means for internal movement until forage ran out and animals were slaughtered, after which human portage and small sleds carried loads from depots to companies. Ammunition scales for rifle companies were adjusted to fixed daily issues, and mortar sections received set numbers of bombs with instructions to fire only on flare signals or prearranged times. The cumulative effect was to maintain defensive fires that could delay assaults but not sustain prolonged counterattacks. Civilians and wounded moved within the same constraints. The fall of Pitomnik ended large-scale evacuation by air. Aid stations near Gumrak and within the city recorded increased retention times for serious cases. Outbound flights prioritized most urgent cases when available. Civilian evacuation across the Volga continued at reduced scale under ice conditions, coordinated with night freight runs to avoid slip congestion. City services focused on keeping a minimum of water points and bake ovens functioning for the garrison and remaining population. Fuel allocations were limited, and operations were synchronized with artillery schedules to reduce exposure. By 23rd to 26th January, the pocket fragmented into northern and southern groups as Soviet forces pressed in from the west and north. Gumrak was lost, and remaining landing grounds were within range of small arms and mortar fire. Air deliveries became drops into marked zones or attempted landings that could not be turned. Intake fell to levels that did not support daily requirements. Bread rations in several formations dropped below 200 grams. Ammunition issues for heavy weapons were cut further, and many batteries conserved the last shells for direct fire at short range. Small arms and mortar ammunition remained available in limited quantities due to their lighter loads and priority in earlier deliveries, but distribution from central dumps to forward companies lagged as sled routes were cut. Soviet formations entering the central districts received steady, if not excessive, resupply. Night truck columns and hand carries delivered ammunition into schoolyards, warehouses, and courtyards identified as temporary dumps. Replacement companies moved up to hold blocks cleared during the day. Signal detachments laid new lines to keep resupply orders off radio nets, and traffic control units enforced one-way movement on narrow streets to prevent jams. The Don Front maintained the flow by staging fresh regiments and guns into captured suburbs and by using captured German stocks where calibers matched. Ammunition logs note the issue of captured 7.92mm belts to units equipped with captured machine guns to avoid mixing calibers at company level. Surrender occurred in two sequences. In the southern city sectors around the central district, commanders ceased resistance around 31st January. In the northern factory sector, organized resistance continued until February 2nd. The immediate material consequences were catalogued. Remaining stocks of ammunition, fuel, and rations were seized. Airfields and landing strips were secured, and remaining aircraft wrecks and ground equipment were collected. German personnel taken prisoner numbered in the tens of thousands, including wounded who could no longer be moved. Soviet medical services and transport were assigned to process and move prisoners under winter conditions, while engineering detachments began clearing routes through debris to reopen river slips and to connect captured areas with staging depots. Comparative figures illustrate the logistical end state. The encircled force had entered the pocket in November with more than 200,000 personnel and thousands of horses, supported initially by air deliveries that, on favorable days, exceeded 200 tons, but on many days fell below 100 tons, against estimated daily needs in the range of 500 to 700 tons, depending on activity. By late January, average intake was far below requirement, and internal movement capacity had been reduced by horse losses, fuel scarcity, and loss of airfields. The Soviet side sustained nightly provisioning of 62nd Army at scaled levels while building and supplying 2 rings for encirclement and reduction, supported by railheads east of the Volga and winter roads maintained by engineer units. Their supply network maintained a tempo sufficient to support continuous assaults during Operation Ring and to hold against external pressure. Immediate consequences were administrative and humanitarian as well as military. Soviet authorities organized distribution of captured stocks to units in contact, evacuated large numbers of wounded and civilians from the city, and began surveys of damaged infrastructure. Rail movement into the East Bank resumed regular patterns as air raids ceased, and ferry cycles stabilized under ice protocols. German records from the final days note depletion of medical supplies, fuel exhaustion in many units, and ammunition reserved for last-ditch defense. Prisoner columns moved west under guard, placing additional demands on rail and road capacity already tasked with moving artillery and assault units to new sectors. Withdrawal, in the strict sense, occurred on only one side. German formations that had approached during Winter Storm withdrew from the Mishkova line to new positions farther to the west and southwest, consuming fuel and ammunition allotted for covering movements and demolishing bridges to slow pursuit. Depots that had supported the relief effort were either evacuated or overrun during the December-January battles, reducing stockpiles available for subsequent operations. On the Soviet side, units remained in place to secure the city and the pocket area, while others redeployed for operations along the Don and in the Caucasus approaches, drawing on the same rail corridors that had sustained the encirclement. By the first week of February, combat operations in the city had ended. The river lifeline that had fed the defense reverted to supporting clearance, reconstruction, and lateral movement of units. The rail and road net east of the Volga resumed scheduled freight for operations elsewhere. The logistics ledger for Stalingrad closed not with surplus, but with balances that explain the outcome. One side's intake fell below requirement and could not be restored. The other maintained sufficient flow across rail, road, and river to continue assault and siege tasks until organized resistance ceased. The legacy of the battle measured itself first in ledgers, then in doctrine, and only later in commemorations. The encircled force that capitulated in late January and early February 1943 left behind records of intake and issue that clarified limits of air supply and the primacy of contiguous ground lines. German files summarized a requirement in the range of 500 to 700 tons per day for a force of more than 200,000 personnel and thousands of animals, with air delivery that on favorable days exceeded 200 tons, but on many days fell well below 100 tons. 62nd Army and continuous rail intake for the encircling fronts, with engineer maintenance of ice roads and pontoon approaches specified by the hour. The numbers, gathered independently and for different purposes, converged on a general lesson. Where rail and river could be kept open, armies could sustain major operations. Where these were denied, aircraft could supplement but not replace bulk delivery. Operational consequences appeared within months. In spring 1943, German planning for the summer campaign prioritized rail repair, ammunition preloading, and defensive stockpiling along interior lines. Fuel allocations and ammunition tables for formations facing Soviet mechanized forces were set with greater margins, while the Luftwaffe avoided promises to maintain continuous air supply to encircled corps or armies. The Soviet side, preparing for summer operations, drew opposite but related conclusions. Stavka directives emphasized synchronized rail movements to form artillery concentrations and to move tank armies between fronts, while river flotillas were expanded for lateral support along the Don and Dnieper. Engineer directorates formed additional rail and bridge brigades to raise the speed of repair after breakthroughs. In both systems, staff work linked tactical objectives explicitly to the capacity of rails and roads within specified windows. Strategic effects extended beyond the Eastern Front. Allied planners studying reports from the Volga drew caution for air supply promises. Later operations in the Mediterranean and Northwest Europe still employed airborne logistics, but staff papers limited objectives to periods and tonnages within demonstrated lift. The experience of winter 1942 to 1943 made repeated appearances in post-war analyses that compared aircraft types, runway cycles, and drop accuracy with daily consumption by divisions in contact. Air transport retained value for high-priority items and emergencies. It did not become a substitute for railheads and ports. Political outcomes included the reordering of priorities for resource allocation. In Berlin, the loss of an army and of equipment recorded in inventories forced redistribution of weapons and vehicles away from offensive projects toward rebuilding and defense. Transportation directorates faced the problem that had appeared in the summer of 1942 in reverse. Longer lines over damaged infrastructure, fewer locomotives and trucks than schedules demanded, and growing competition between fronts for delivery slots. In Moscow, the successful use of river and rail to sustain both a city defense and an encirclement justified continued investment in the Volga corridor, in the industrial regions east of the river, and in the rail net that linked them to the front. The battle also supported arguments for maintaining large central reserves of artillery shells and fuel under Stavka control, to be released as operations required. Human consequences were tabulated in prisoner lists and hospital registers. Roughly 91,000 German and Allied personnel entered captivity in the final days, including thousands of wounded. Many would not return due to disease, exposure, and wartime conditions along evacuation routes and in camps. Soviet units recorded casualties consistent with continuous urban fighting and winter operations. Medical services expanded triage and evacuation procedures that had been tested during the defense and applied them to the reduction. Civilian records noted evacuations across the river and the resumption of limited services once artillery fire ceased. These figures shaped post-war debates about responsibility, decision-making, and the balance between military necessity and human cost without dictating judgments. Memory anchored itself to infrastructure as much as to narratives. In the rebuilt city, river ports resumed movement of fuel and bulk cargo. Rail yards restored through lines and added sidings that reflected wartime experience with dispersal. Memorial sites took shape near factory districts and on the heights, while cemeteries for Soviet and German dead were organized along the approaches. Veterans on both sides described the battle in terms that returned to material facts. Crates carried from slips, sledges pulled from airfields, rations issued by gram, shells counted out by gun. Public ceremonies translated this into symbols. Staff colleges kept the arithmetic in manuals. Historiography developed lines of inquiry that remain visible. One examines the airlift's feasibility. Comparisons draw on aircraft serviceability rates, runway hours at Pitomnik and Gumrak, average payloads for Ju-50s and pressed bombers, and daily weather data. Single-day peaks above 200 tons stand alongside sequences of days below 100. Analysts contrast these with consumption tables for divisions, artillery regiments, and hospitals inside the pocket. A second line studies the Volga system as a case of river logistics under sustained interdiction. Records show barge and ferry cycles by night, smoke coverage durations, and distribution times from shore to block caches. A third line addresses gauge conversion and rail repair in a fast-moving theater. Reports quantify kilometers relayed per day, axle load limits on temporary bridges, and the effect of single track meets on throughput. Each line treats the battle less as a unique catastrophe than as a data set for planning under fire. Comparative perspectives broaden the legacy. For Germany, the battle underscored that deep penetrations without rail follow-up create exposed salients with growing motor transport demands and declining unit readiness. For the Soviet Union, it validated the integration of strategic industry east of the Volga with river and rail distribution to the front, and it strengthened confidence in multi-front operations that depended on central scheduling of transport. For allies elsewhere, it offered a model for joint analysis of air, river, rail, and road as a single system, with risk captured not only in enemy action, but in weather, maintenance, and human endurance. Longer-term significance includes the shaping of post-war military economics. Studies of the battle informed calculations of ton-mile costs, the design of rail repair units, and the composition of theater-level transport commands. Civil planning adopted lessons about dispersal of yards and ports, alternative landings, and the value of night movement under blackout and smoke. Museums and curricula presented the events as a combined case of urban warfare and logistics under maximum stress, pairing maps of advances with charts of deliveries and consumption. The battle's legacy, therefore, rests in how it reframed expectations. Commanders after 1943 rarely promised to hold or take major objectives without specifying how many trains, how many tons by river, and how many flights per day would be required, and for how long. Analysts used Stalingrad's data to test claims about what air transport could accomplish and what rail and river must achieve. Commemoration preserved names and places. Doctrine preserved procedures and numbers. In the decades that followed, discussions of large operations routinely returned to the basic comparison that decided outcomes on the Volga, 1942 to 1943. Daily requirements against actual deliveries, measured not in abstractions but in grams per man, shells per gun, and tons per day sustained across the chosen line of supply.